From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Weston. Welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. We want to turn to Georgia, because tomorrow Georgia is going to hold perhaps the most consequential Senate runoff election in history. And our colleague, Emily Wilkins, is on the scene to cover it for Bloomberg. So, Emily, thank you so much for being here. We have both President Trump and President-elect Biden heading to the state today. Give us a sense of their closing arguments. What are the messages they're trying to get across?
The main message that we've really heard from both campaigns is that the stake of the Senate is here in Georgia, that the who wins the runoff is going to determine which party winds up controlling the Senate. Now, it'll be interesting to hear what both Biden and Trump say today in light of Trump's call yesterday to Georgia Secretary of State Raffensperger, asking him if he could find votes to overturn essentially what Georgia voters did in the November 3rd election.
So that was big news, no question about it, Emily. At the same time, if you're a Republican in Georgia, is it going to change your vote at this point?
You know, I spoke with a lot of Republicans here in Georgia, and they agree with President Trump for the most part, that there was fraud in the November 3rd election and that it does need to be investigated. And so I'm not quite sure exactly how many Republicans, after hearing that phone call, aren't going to go ahead and vote for Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue.
Fascinating. Emily, really glad to have you down in Georgia. We're going to be coming back to you for the next 2 or 3 days, I'm happy to say. That's Emily Wilkins, our colleague at Bloomberg down in Georgia. Now, for his take on what we should be looking for in Georgia, we welcome Bloomberg political contributor Rick Davis of Stone Court Capital. So Rick, give us your sense about what's going to happen here. And let me say, first of all, if the same people voted the same way in this election as they did November 3rd, then the Republicans will win, won't they?
Well, that's a big question as to whether they will vote the same way that they voted just a month ago. It looks like turnout seems to be mirroring the general election. About this time in the general election, a couple days before, there were about 3.5 million early voters that had voted, and there's just a few less than that have voted already in the primary or in the runoff. So there's a lot of participation. I mean, it was a historic turnout in the general, and they expect probably a historic statewide turnout for a runoff. I would say there is a little bit of a wild card in that some of the Republican districts seem to be below their general election early vote turnout. So there's concern amongst the GOP that there's a flat Republican turnout so far. And there are 120,000 people who didn't vote in the historic general election that had the biggest turnout in history in Georgia who have shown up for the runoff. And so the question is, what do they bring to the table? Will they be part of the wild card? Remember, the presidential election was determined by less than 12,000 votes, and so you can anticipate this being a barn burner at the same time.
What about new voter registrations? As I understand, there have been quite a few new voters registered just since November 3rd.
Yeah, and that could incorporate some of the 118,000 people who did not vote in the general election who have already voted early ballot in this election. So there is some tracking of that, and that could actually have an impact. Both parties have been very aggressive at voter registration, and so it's unlikely that we're going to know whether or not the Democrats or the Republicans took advantage of this more than one or the other. I would say, too, that early votes, early balloting, early polling looked like it was trending toward the Republican favor, but in the last week before Christmas, it did seem to start to tick toward the Democrats. And so these polls all are within the margin of error, and so, it could indicate an election outcome either way.
And President Trump is not on the ballot. As much as maybe he would like to be on the ballot, he's not on the ballot. And a lot of commentators were wrong, actually, about the down ballot in the November 3rd. Indeed, President-elect Biden won the presidency, but a lot of the down ballot did not go as Democrat as people were predicting.
Well, this was especially the case in Georgia. David Perdue was expected to garner 50% plus in the general election, but wasn't able to do it and had to be forced into a runoff. It was always felt that Kelly Loeffler was going to be pressured by another Republican on the ballot in the general election and have to go to a runoff. But all those bets are off now, and so the national attention, $500 million of spending, and both President Trump and President-elect Biden are in the state today to try and sway an outcome.
So it's almost impossible, certainly for me to predict what effect President Trump will have. But what do you think about this recording that we heard dramatically over the weekend of President Trump really trying to, and I'll use the word sort of strong-armed the Republican Secretary of State in the state to change like 11,780 votes?
Yeah, this has been the top news item in Georgia over the weekend is the president's Saturday call with the Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, who, by all accounts, has been very independent and handled the controversies around the election and the subsequent investigations into illicit voting extremely well. And as you point out, the president made it totally clear to him that he expected him to go out and find close to 12,000 votes to allow him to win the election. Notice he wasn't talking about ballot security associated with the runoff, which is in 2 days or in 1 day. It was all about his election and still prosecuting his loss. So this actually takes a lot of attention away from Perdue and Loeffler, who are trying to make a comment that the Democrats could push a socialist agenda in Washington if they're not elected. And so I do think it's been a huge distraction to their statewide campaigns of trying to keep the heat on Democrats.
Rick, you're a true veteran in these campaigns. You've run so many, including John McCain's for president. Give us your take on whether, in fact, the Republicans might have it a bit easier in this election because they have one message, as I understand it, which is those Democrats are radicals. They're going to take us in a radical direction. You don't want to go there. On the other hand, the Democrats have a more diffuse message, don't they? Have different constituents they have to appeal to. It's not one line they can give them.
Yeah, it's a much harder task for the Democrats on a message appeal. And I would say there are two really critical messages that the Republicans have in their arsenal. One is this radical socialist agenda, which has been part of the Trump campaign and now a hallmark of the Loeffler-Perdue campaign. But they also have divided government on their side. They know now that Nancy Pelosi is going to be Speaker and that President-elect Biden will be in the White House. And so if you want protection from one-party rule, you've got to elect us in order to be the bulwark against Democratic policies flying through the Senate. And that has a very good tone in Georgia, where the national Republican leadership, Pelosi and Schumer, are far further left than most Democrats in the state of Georgia.
Okay, Rick, thank you so very much. That's Bloomberg political contributor Rick Davis, and I'm delighted to say Rick will be with me tomorrow night for Bloomberg TV and radio special coverage of the Georgia runoff elections. That's going to start when the polls close in Georgia at 7 p.m. New York time. But right now, let's get a check on the markets. Joining us now is Kaylee Lyons. So, Kaylee, this is Balance of Power. I'd like to say it's all about Georgia. It doesn't. I'm not sure that's exactly right. I think the markets have some other problems today.
Yeah, we do still have a pandemic going on, David. I think that has a little something to do with what we're seeing today. We did see stocks open the new year at record highs, but we quickly reversed those gains, and now we're right around the lows of the session. The S&P 500 and NASDAQ 100 each down around 2% at this point, really faced with potentially the fact that markets were over-optimistic into the end of 2020 about the vaccine, about hopes for a recovery, faced with the grim reality that the virus is still ongoing and getting worse before it gets better. So maybe pulling back from some of those very frothy valuations as countries like the UK move more toward tighter restrictions. Within the S&P 500, it's really big tech leading the losses. Apple, Microsoft, the biggest point drags on the S&P 500, but every sector within the index is lower on the day. Across asset classes, you are seeing the dollar start to gain back some strength. It is well off the lows of the session. Again, the dollar really a proxy for the recovery play. And I have to talk about Bitcoin, David. Yesterday crossed above $34,000, though we are reversing a bit today. It's down about 6 percentage points. At the moment, though, it's still up about 7.5% from where it closed before the New Year's holiday. And finally, David, I just want to talk about the bond market, because even though you're seeing these steep losses in equities, you're not seeing that safe haven bid show up. The 10-year yield today going nowhere right now, sitting around 90 basis points, stubbornly below that 1% level. But this, David, is where Georgia does come into this market. All eyes are on those runoff races you were just discussing with Rick. If it surprises and is a Democratic sweep, that could mean more larger stimulus that is coming in this new year. That could mean better economic growth. And the consensus seems to be that would mean higher yields and that the 10-year yield could actually break again above 1% for the first time since March, David.
They keep talking about it. It doesn't happen yet, but perhaps the reflation trade. Thank you so much to Kayla Lyons for that report on the markets. Coming up, the more we learn, the worse it gets. We go through this Russian cyber attack with Kiersten Todt of Cyber Readiness Institute. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We're going to turn now to Mark Crumpton for Bloomberg First Word News.
David, thank you. President Trump and President-elect Joe Biden will each make last-minute campaign appearances in Georgia today for candidates in 2 runoff elections that will determine control of the U.S. Senate. For President Trump, the visit comes days after pressuring top Georgia officials to find enough votes to overturn his loss to Mr. Biden in the state. Mr. Trump will rally for incumbents David Perdue and Kelly Loeffler. President-elect Biden will be stumping on behalf of challengers Raphael Warnock and Jon Ossoff. New York City plans to ramp up the pace of COVID-19 vaccinations. Mayor Bill de Blasio says the city expects to give 400,000 vaccinations a week by the end of this month. The city has administered about 100,000 doses since it began vaccinating residents on December 15th. He says educators and first responders will be added to the groups of people eligible to receive the vaccine in the current phase. The UK is bracing for a third national lockdown. Prime Minister Boris Johnson will address the nation tonight. He's expected to announce new COVID restrictions as new cases top 50,000 a day. Hospital admissions have soared past the peak of the first wave in April. The country entered a second hard lockdown before Christmas in order to avoid a holiday-related spike. And Scotland is going into lockdown again as coronavirus cases spike. First Minister Nicola Sturgeon told the Scottish Parliament in Edinburgh there was no choice but to take more drastic action as hospital admissions have reached levels not seen since April.
We have decided to introduce from midnight tonight for the duration of January a legal requirement to stay at home except for essential purposes. This is similar to the lockdown of March last year.
And Minister Sturgeon also says the country is ramping up its vaccination program with people getting the shot developed by the University of Oxford and AstraZeneca beginning today. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
Thank you so much, Mark. Well, the one thing we know for sure about the massive Russian cyber attack in the United States, but that's on public and private computers as well, is that we really don't know how bad it is. To help us start to sort through some of the questions, welcome now Kiersten Todt. She is Managing Director of the Cyber Readiness Institute and resident scholar at the University of Pittsburgh. Ms. Todt served as Executive Director of President Obama's National Cybersecurity Commission. So, Ms. Todt, thank you so much for being with us. Start with the most basic. What do we know about how bad this is?
Well, thank you very much, David, for having me on. The simple answer is we don't know how bad this is. What we do know is that Russia has infiltrated both our government and our industry networks, but the extent of that damage and that infiltration is still being determined. And we should always assume when we're responding to a cyber attack that it's worse than what we currently know.
Should it bother us that, as I understand it, according to published news reports, the government didn't even tell us that it happened? It actually came from a private company called FireEye. What does it say if private security firms are the ones who have to spot these problems?
Well, it's certainly concerning that the government wasn't able to detect this. But one of the lessons that we're already seeing from this severe attack is we recognize that neither government nor industry can prepare for, respond, detect these types of attacks on their own, and that government and industry have to be working together. We do know that the private sector has developed mature and sophisticated capabilities, but that government certainly has an ability to have a whole of nation response. So we have to be focused on that government industry collaboration for the future.
What does it tell us that apparently this was because of a private company, a contract with the U.S. government, and also private companies called SolarWinds? How vulnerable are we as a country because of our use of some of these contractors?
Well, this attack certainly has put supply chain security at the forefront. It's not that we haven't looked at supply chain security in the past, but clearly our tactics for addressing these issues are weak. They're not as strong as they need to be. One of the things that we've recently learned is that the maintenance of the SolarWinds software was occurring in Eastern Europe, and that was a choice on the part of SolarWinds. And as we delve a little bit deeper into this, what it looks like is that SolarWinds as a company was prioritizing cost and ROI over security. This isn't unusual. So when we look at the Biden administration, when we look at what needs to happen, being able to minimize our threat surface by working with our supply chain more effectively to make sure that those companies that are involved in both government and industry security are prioritizing security. And we're certainly not seeing that right now.
Kiersten, as I said, you ran as the executive director of President Obama's Cybersecurity Commission. Is this something that the U.S. government would normally know? That is, that one of the contractors they're working with are subcontracting to Eastern European companies? I mean, do they have to report those sort of things? Is there somebody in the government that monitors it?
That's a great question. And I think that one of the key issues is that they're not reporting instruments in place for this type of development, because what we know is if it's a US-based company, that is one of the key security requirements. But it's not clear that they're going to ask, where are you maintaining the software? Where are different operations occurring? We've seen threads of this and other issues around TikTok, where the data is housed, where it's being serviced. And certainly this is something we need to be looking at for the future, because it would seem without a doubt that if there is software being used by the government, that it shouldn't be maintained in Eastern Europe.
You mentioned the quest for profitability, which is perfectly understandable. Nothing wrong with that. At the same time, sometimes you can sacrifice security. That's in the public domain. What about in the private domain? When we learned about Microsoft actually disclosing that they got access to source code, which, as I understand it, is like really the sacred thing their company wants to protect. Is it possible that our big tech companies, in the name of really expanding as fast as possible and gaining market share and gaining market cap, may have sacrificed some private security themselves?
Well, I think there are two questions here, because I think Microsoft and the larger companies are a different animal than the smaller vendors that we see in the supply chain. And those smaller companies typically don't prioritize security because they're looking at return on investment. They're looking at how to have minimized cost. And oftentimes they're looking at being able to bring their products first to market, and they prioritize that over secure to market. And as an entity that exists in the commercial space, they can make those choices. But what we haven't been able to do in government or industry and create incentives, either legislatively, regulatory, or otherwise, is make sure and create regulation that ensures a prioritization of security in these vendors that are being used by the United States government.
This is a much larger discussion, obviously, that we'd love you to come back and have more with us, but let me be unfair at the end. If you were going to give one recommendation to President-elect Biden as he comes in, what would be the number one first thing he should do?
The Biden administration should prioritize a response to the SolarWinds attack, which it's already come out to say that it's going to do. And I would say the three pieces to this are government and industry working together before an event happens. Industry has early detection capabilities that the government can apply a whole of government approach to. That's a priority. The second is to be able to ensure that we are developing requirements and standards for supply chain security that far exceed what they are right now. And importantly, a third piece to this is government. The United States government has to reach out and work much more collaboratively with its international partners, because we can't do this by ourselves. We have to work with like-minded economic partners to create standards around what is acceptable in the cyber realm and the cyber domain.
Thank you so very much. As I say, the beginning of a much longer discussion. That's Kiersten Todt. She is Managing Director of the Cyber Readiness Institute. Still ahead here, financial firms leaving New York. Virtu is the latest, and we'll have the reasons why it's doing that next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Manhattan is losing more of its financial sector. Virtu is moving workers to Florida, adding to a wave of financial firms setting up bases outside Manhattan as the pandemic transforms how and where people work. Let's bring in now Bloomberg's Linan Nguyen for more. So, Linan, first of all, I want to be precise. I'm not sure these workers were working in Manhattan. Weren't they actually over in the Bronx or Queens?
Their base is in Manhattan, and they're technically based there, but obviously people have scattered throughout the pandemic, so a lot of people are working from home at this stage, so in remote locations or at home.
So how much of this is the pandemic in your reporting as opposed to perhaps larger forces that perhaps would have had this happen no matter what?
So this is really interesting, David, because the pandemic has basically accelerated this force. Virtu is talking about this as a longer term and more permanent shift where they'll have hubs and bases around the U.S. in different places, and they're really going to shrink their footprint in Manhattan by 75%. So it's really catalyzed what was already in motion, and I think it's shown people that they can be productive and profitable without being based in the city.
Well, give us a sense of what other firms. We all heard reports. Bloomberg had a report, actually, that I believe Goldman was moving some of its wealth management operations to Florida. What other financial institutions are moving?
That's right, David. So Goldman's thinking about moving asset management, and then we have Citadel and Elliott Management. A lot of firms are really trying to look at the Sunshine State as sort of the next place to build up a hub. There's plenty of reasons for it, actually. First of all, sun, space, and quality of life in Florida. The fact that you can kind of have a lot of nice recreational opportunities down there. But then there's also the idea that, now that many of us are working from home, maybe it's not necessary to be based in sort of big metropolitan areas. And on top of that, obviously, Florida has, no personal income tax. And so that will be a boon for anyone moving down there. It'll be an immediate sort of jump in their pay.
Well, that may answer the question I had, which is how are they going to recruit workers down in Florida? They're not the same as New York. And you're saying maybe they don't need to. They can do it virtually.
Well, there's the potential for virtual working, but then also the fact that, many of these workers, there are a lot of universities in Florida. So that's one thing. They can recruit younger talent from local universities. And on top of that, I think there is that kind of added appeal of obviously a pay boost from low taxes. And then on top of that, just this idea that in the pandemic, people have sort of reprioritized what they want to do. They want more space at home, and being crammed in apartments in the city is maybe not as appealing as it once was.
Sounds plausible. Thank you so much for this terrific report from Bloomberg's Linan Nguyen. Up next, the effort to get the votes in Georgia from Deborah Scott of Georgia Stand Up. And this is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston with some breaking news right now. CNBC is reporting that the Amazon Berkshire Hathaway JP Morgan healthcare venture is going to shut down. You remember this was announced to great fanfare. They were going to revolutionize the way we provide healthcare to our employees. Well, it is now, according to CNBC at least, shutting down. For more Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. We are learning more about what led up to that hour-long phone call with President Trump pressuring Georgia election officials to turn the November election his way. On December 31st, Mr. Trump sued Georgia's Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger and Georgia Governor Brian Kemp, trying to force the state to decertify its election result and allow its Republican-led legislature to declare the winner instead. The suit complains that President-elect Biden won the state by, quote, only 11,779 votes. That's one vote shy of the number of votes Mr. Trump told Raffensperger to, quote, find in this weekend's phone call. The UK today became the first nation in the world to start using the COVID-19 vaccine developed by Oxford University and drug maker AstraZeneca, giving the injection to an 82-year-old kidney dialysis patient. Britain has moved rapidly on approvals and rollouts than the U.S. or the European Union. Officials cleared the AstraZeneca Oxford product despite clinical trials that involved a smaller number of participants and that were complicated by a dosing error. In Israel, the country's health minister has set out an ambitious coronavirus vaccine plan. He spoke with Bloomberg Television.
judging by the wonderful response of the population and the efficiency of the medical teams here, we can get probably to 70–80% of those eligible to get the vaccine somewhere, I believe, in April, May. I think that we are getting there and we are not going to slow down.
Israel has already administered the first doses of the Pfizer shot to about 1.2 million residents, or more than 12% of its population. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
Thank you so much, Mark. I want to pick up on that Georgia story Mark was just talking about. Tomorrow, Georgia is going to hold its 2 runoff elections that will determine which party holds the majority in the U.S. Senate. Yesterday, Stacey Abrams, the former Georgia House Minority Leader, emphasized the importance of new voters and voters of color.
More than 100,000 voters who did not participate in November are voting in this election, have already cast their ballots, and they are disproportionately voters of color and disproportionately young voters. And what I remind people of is that in the statewide election, you don't win county by county, you win person by person, and that's what we've been doing.
We welcome now one of those who has been working very hard to turn out the vote in Georgia. She is Deborah Scott, and she's Executive Director of Georgia Stand Up. So, Ms. Scott, thank you so much for being with us. Pick up on what Stacey Abrams was talking. 100,000 voters that didn't vote November 3rd. There was sort of record turnout November 3rd. What is going on?
Actually, it was 120,000. So what's going on is young people that were out in the streets protesting in the uprising over the summer. You know, one of the things that we taught them and we continue to teach them is they have to vote and vote their power. We explain to them the importance of making sure that they register to vote. And so that's been our ongoing message. And I think it's resonating that we have these young folks that are seeing that a political tool that they have is actually the vote. And a number of them got registered to vote. And then you had a number of 17-and-a-half-year-olds that were not eligible for the November election that are eligible for the January election that are able to vote. So we're going to see a resurgence of these young folks. We know that 3 million people have already voted in Georgia, and we know that there's going to be many more coming out. So we're targeting between Black families and young voters. I think they're going to make the difference in this election.
Okay, if that's right, if those are the people who make the difference, give us a sense of what will motivate them to cut out vote or how they will vote. I mean, is this issue driven? We don't have President Trump on the ballot anymore.
Right. So you know what? People are voting their values. They're voting those kitchen table issues. When we're talking to voters, they're talking about what's happening in their families, what's happening in their communities. They want to know about the vaccine and COVID-19 tests and where food insecurity issues are. They want to know about affordable housing and expansion of Medicaid. And so when you can translate those kitchen table issues to voter issues, then you'll see the turnout. And that's what's happening now. People are relating their power to their currency, and their currency is their vote. And so what we say is if you're unhappy with the way things are, then you need to go out and vote. That's a tool in your toolbox.
Do we have any indication at this point of early voting? I know that it's been a lot. There have been a lot of people early voting. Do you have a sense of Democrat versus Republican? I know your organization is nonpartisan.
We are definitely nonpartisan. What we're hearing is more than half of them are progressive voters that have already voted. We know that more in the metro areas and more Black and brown people have voted early than have ever before in a kind of runoff race that we're in. So this is historic. I think they already have won in a sense that because people see early voting as a tool, and they took advantage of the holiday season and went out and voted. So win, lose, or draw in terms of whoever they wanted, I think in this case, the voters are actually winning because they get to see that the more they turn out, the more power they'll have, the more they'll be able to make decisions about who is going to represent them.
Even though his name is not on the ballot, do you have any sense of the extent to which President Trump may be motivating people to come out and vote? Certainly, there's a lot of news over the weekend with this recording of his telephone conversation with the Secretary of State of the state of Georgia, trying to tell him to come up with some more votes down there. Do you have a sense of whether that's motivating the Republican base, getting people out to vote more, or maybe actually discouraging people?
And I've heard a little bit of them both. We're going to stay and keep our blinders on. Our goal is to make sure we have voters that actually go out and vote, whatever their values are. Of course, we are targeting Black and brown people and young people, and they tend to vote progressively. However, with the blinders on, we're saying that it doesn't matter who you vote for, but just go and vote and exercise that right. And so we're seeing more of that. We know that President Trump is coming tomorrow. We also know that that Biden and some other folks are coming. All of that helps, the media helps, but what we want to make sure people realize is after everything is over, it will be Georgia voters that are left here to deal with whatever happens. And we want to make sure that Georgia voters understand that there is a receipt that is due to them. They are in the middle of this international spotlight because they have voted their values. And so once this is over, they have an agenda. They want to see more affordable health care, more affordable housing, more jobs that pay a livable wage. They want to see an increase in the minimum wage. So there are things that people are going to be asking these elected officials to show the receipts of the things that they've done and to also hold them accountable every step of the way.
So finally, just on that point about what happens next, how do you make sure that what you're doing to get the vote out this time is not a one-off? That is to say that it continues into the future, the level of participation.
Yeah, so our organization, Georgia Stand Up, is an organization that works 365 days of the year. Voter registration and voter engagement and voter empowerment is just one of the things that we do. We also do policy and leadership development and workforce development. So it's a part of an ongoing strategy. So we go right into the city elections right after this, because we know that if we're going to change conditions in these communities, it takes one vote at a time. That's one voter at a time. That's one Mrs. Johnson at a time. That's one Mrs. Jackson at a time, having those conversations about where her pain points are and what are the solutions to some of her problems. So we're excited about her living and the communities living their power by making sure that they go out and vote.
Okay, thank you so much. Great having you with us today. That is Deborah Scott. She's Executive Director of Georgia Stand Up. And we'll have full coverage of the results in the Georgia Senate runoff tomorrow night. That's going to start at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. That is the time that the polls close in Georgia. Coming up, glitches in the vaccination program. We talk with Dr. William Moss of Johns Hopkins. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. That massive vaccination program in the United States isn't quite as massive as was hoped, at least not yet, something Dr. Anthony Fauci admitted over the weekend.
We are not where we want to be, no doubt about that. But I think we can get there if we really accelerate, get some momentum going, and see what happens as we get into the first couple of weeks of January.
To take us through where we are and what we need to do to get better, we welcome now Bloomberg's senior editor for healthcare. He is Drew Armstrong. So, Drew, do we have a sense of where the bottleneck is, or maybe there's more than one?
I think what we know right now is that there's a bottleneck in the last mile of vaccine delivery. If you look at the numbers that we have, a lot of data pulled from CDC and directly from states, you're seeing millions and millions of doses of vaccine that have been distributed and shipped out to states, and then only a fraction of that actually being administered on the front lines. Right now, I believe our latest count was 13 million doses of vaccine distributed, but only a third of those have been used. And the picture really varies state by state. Some states like South Dakota have burned through 70% of their allocation, and then you see places like Georgia and Kansas that have only used about 17%. Some lag certainly in the data there, but it tells you that there is a very, very, very wide set of results happening on the ground right now.
Is this really a local phenomenon? And I guess that's a way of asking, is there anything, for example, President-elect Biden, when he comes in, can do to help fix that problem at a national level?
Yeah, I mean, it's a problem that is being shown at the local level, but almost certainly comes from a lack of resources provided at the federal level. We've heard for months now from the CDC itself and from state vaccination officials that they needed billions of dollars to be ready with the infrastructure to roll this out. And we have not even gotten to the biggest, most complicated part of the vaccine rollout process when we're going to open this much more widely to the general public. Already seeing some signs of potential problems there in places like Texas and Florida, huge lines, messy registration, so on and so forth.
Okay, thank you so much. Always great to have you with us. That's Bloomberg's Drew Armstrong. Welcome now, Dr. William Moss. He is Executive Director of the International Vaccine Access Center at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, a school which is supported by Michael R. Bloomberg, founder and majority owner of our parent company. So, Dr. Moss, thank you so much for being with us. Yeah, I think you just heard what Drew Armstrong had to say. It's that last mile. What is your analysis of what the problem is and what, if anything, can be done to address it?
Yes, and thank you for having me. I think of this as the 3 Ds, if you will: doses, distribution, and demand. And we knew going into this that we were not going to have sufficient number of doses for everyone who needs a vaccine in this country. And there'd been some thought, high-level thought, about how to prioritize. But that was really done at very high levels, and the devil's really in the details about who you get these vaccines to. But where I think the problem is now is in the distribution. As Drew said, more than 13 million doses distributed, but only a third of those delivered. And I think this, as Drew said, this is really a lack of planning, a lack of federal resources and personnel to deliver vaccines. Many countries around the world do mass vaccination campaigns. These are done for, childhood infections. And they do months of planning and work out what we call micro plans, where real details are worked out about how vaccines are going to be distributed and put in the arms of children. And we just didn't have that level of planning. We're trying to do it on the fly as the vaccines become available. And that, too, is one of the challenges. States just don't know how many vaccines they're going to get, and hospitals and nursing care facilities don't know how many vaccines they're going to get. So they're trying to do this on the fly. The third D is demand. And, that's something that certainly we need to have, be sure that we can have the community's trust and acceptability of these vaccines, and that anything we do doesn't disrupt that demand.
Dr. Moss, let's focus on one of the things you mentioned, which is personnel. It's not just doing it on the fly, it's doing it at a time when our hospital, our healthcare system is under extreme stress from increased cases of COVID, increased hospitalizations. Do we have the people to do the inoculations when they're busy trying to keep people alive in ICUs?
No, you're exactly right. That's a really good point. Both the states and the healthcare facilities are overwhelmed, taking care of patients, doing the testing that needs to be done, and they just don't have the bandwidth to be administering vaccines. As in the United Kingdom, in India right now, they are training tens of thousands of people to deliver vaccines. That's what we should have been doing here in the United States months ago, just preparing the healthcare personnel to be able to administer vaccines.
How long would it take to get that situation corrected? We do have a new president coming in January 20th. He said this is his number one priority, no doubt about it. He's put together a team, but as a practical matter, what is the lead time on training up the people to give the inoculations?
Yeah, I think it can be done pretty quickly, but it has to be done in a coordinated manner. We have to enlist the help of schools of nursing, medical schools, people who have some health training and have some experience. And I think within a couple weeks, we could train a large force to be able to administer vaccines. But again, it has to be done in a coordinated way with guidance, starting at the federal level, down to the state level, working with all of our healthcare institutions, as I said, schools of nursing, schools of medicine, to get large numbers of vaccinated trained.
Doctor, is this likely to get worse before it gets better in this specific sense? Right now we're talking about really administering this vaccine to healthcare workers and people in nursing homes. Those people actually have access to healthcare right now. What about when we go out to the general population, particularly some of the underserved parts of the population that don't regularly see a doctor anyway?
I think this is a really critical point. We will learn some of the logistics better. We'll have more vaccinators trained, but it's going harder as we move into, other high-risk groups, just identifying who those people are, setting the priorities for those individuals, which combination of comorbidities are going to put people higher in line, and really getting out to the communities. What is done in other countries in mass vaccination campaigns is they do outreach. They set up the vaccination centers in the communities so they can reach them. And I think we're going to need to do the same, but we just haven't had the planning, both at the federal and state level, to be able to do that yet.
Don't have the planning. How much of it's money? Are we going to need to appropriate a lot more money to get this done properly?
Well, it will require resources. It's going to require resources, financial resources, to set up these outreach vaccination facilities. It's going to require financial resources to have the personnel to administer the vaccines, to transport all the equipment and vaccines to these outreach centers. There's no doubt about it. The recent stimulus package has some funds to do this, but what the states have received thus far has been insufficient.
And finally, Doctor, how much of this can be done as a private-public partnership? President Trump was very proud of the fact that they got the Warp Speed project up and going. They did deliver vaccines in really record time. A lot of scientists were surprised they got the vaccines that fast. Is there some parallel thing that could be done in the public health administration here with public and private? Because I'm not sure if the federal government itself has the resources.
Yes, no, I think there is an important role for the private sector here, both in terms of administering vaccines, and we've already seen, the efforts by some of the pharmacies like CVS and Walmart, Walgreens to be able to administer vaccines. They do that already for many of our adult vaccines. But I also think private employers will play a role in vaccinating their workforce, much as we're seeing hospitals and healthcare facilities do that. I think we'll see an expansion of that going forward. So there is a critical role for private-public partnership in this mass vaccination effort.
Dr. Fauci said that he is looking for a time where we're going to be up to 1 million vaccinations a day. Is that realistic? Is that in the near future that we could accomplish that?
I think that can be accomplished, but it's going to take a lot of effort, and it's going to take resources and personnel, as we talked about. But other countries have shown that they can do that. They can vaccinate that number in a day, but it requires this high-level planning and coordination and the resources to be able to do it.
Okay, thank you very much. It was terribly helpful. It's Dr. William Moss of the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. We want to remind you once again, we're going to have live coverage of the Georgia Senate runoff races tomorrow night. That's starting at 7 p.m. New York time. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We're going to wrap up today with yet another check on the markets from Emma Chandra. So, Emma, I have to say, before markets started trading this morning, it looked like we were off to a good start for the new year. You did all right over in Europe, but boy, we've let down the team over here.
Absolutely. We were talking about the global rally continuing here in Europe. We certainly saw European stocks close in the green, and we certainly saw them open in the green in the US, but that quickly reversed. And as you can see now, everything, all the major indices in the red, the S&P 500 and the Dow down both now by more than 2%, really trading at the lows of the session. Every single sector in the S&P 500 in the red today. And we're being led lower by real estate, by industrials, by tech. Looking at sell-offs of around 3% for both Amazon and Apple, of course, giants of companies that really have led some of the rally through the end of 2020. I should also mention something that my colleague Abigail Doolittle has mentioned, and that's that the 50-day moving average for the Dow Industrials, the Dow Industrials currently below their 50-day moving average, and saying it's a very virus-sensitive sector, and that really something that we saw back in January that was one of the first things to sell off when we got the news of of the first Wuhan lockdown. And so that perhaps suggesting why we might be getting some of that sell-off today. Of course, the continued rise in cases in COVID-19 we're seeing in the US and, of course, in Europe. The slower rollout of the vaccine in many places, certainly something you've been discussing, has been happening in the US. In Europe, the UK not doing too badly, but certainly in other nations in Europe, concerns about how slow the vaccine is being rolled out. And certainly what we might be seeing, therefore, is investors being perhaps caught off guard a little bit. We saw through December a lot of enthusiasm. They thought that 2021 was really going to be very, very different from 2020, and that perhaps proving to be not the case, certainly for the first few months of 2021. Very, very volatile at the moment. Certainly seeing the VIX at about 26 at the moment, David.
Well, exactly, I was going to say, and on top of it all, we've seen the VIX really shoot up. At the same time, 10-year bonds are not moving anywhere. For the U.S. 10-year bond, not doing anything.
Yeah, really not moving very much there. And what we're actually seeing, we saw break-evens for the 10-year hit 2% today, suggesting that there are some people who still have a lot of confidence in that reflation trade. And you've been talking, of course, a lot about what's happening in Georgia this week. And therefore, we might get a bit more confidence for that reflation trade, certainly if the Democrats should surprise David.
Thank you so much, Emma. Really great to have you. And Happy New Year, by the way. Coming up, Balance of Power is going to continue on Bloomberg Radio in our second hour. We're going to be talking with former U.S. Senator and former U.S. Ambassador to China, Max Baucus, about what he thinks is going on, particularly with the vote coming up in the Electoral College just on Wednesday. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.